To support this Wild World podcast, please check out Autio. It's an app that gives you amazing stories told by some of the world's best storytellers, such as John Lithgow, Phil Jackson, and Kevin Costner, and it's uniquely curated based on your location. It's a perfect audio travel companion for any road trip or just learning more about a trip you want to take. Click on the link in our show notes for more information.
Big animals tend to get a lot of attention. Who doesn't love to see elephants, gorillas, tigers, or whales? And there's good reasons to appreciate the world's charismatic megafauna. But there are animals that are just as lovable and interesting if you take the time to look a little more carefully. And some of them are doing things that are not just intriguing, they might even offer some valuable lessons.
They are doing all kinds of things in a very coordinated fashion, much as we do. They're moving resources around, defending the troops, even having air conditioning systems and things like that, highway systems with traffic rules in some cases, all kinds of things that intrigue us at first and actually have a certain parallels to humans.
This is Wild World. I'm Scott Solomon, and in today's episode, we visit the land down under to learn about some of its lesser-known, but equally amazing wildlife. Australia is famous for its strange creatures, and rightfully so. They've got kangaroos, koalas, echidnas, and of course one of the wackiest animals anywhere, the platypus. But it's also home to equally weird and wonderful creatures of a different sort. They just tend to be a little smaller. My guest today is Dr. Mark Moffett, who specializes in finding these small wonders and sharing their stories with the world. Mark is an ecologist storyteller. He's the author of several books, most recently The Human Swarm: How Our Societies Arise, Thrive, and Fall. I've got a copy of that one right here, actually. It's a great read, highly recommended. He also wrote a great book that is near and dear to my heart called Adventures Among Ants. And he's also written a book called Face to Face with Frogs, as well as a book called The High Frontier. In addition to these books, he's also been the author of numerous articles in National Geographic magazine, as well as other publications like Scientific American, Smithsonian Magazine, and others. And just to give you a little bit of a sense for the kind of guy that Mark is, I wanted to share a few quotes here from some eminent biologists who have described Mark. The late E.O. Wilson described Mark as having the soul of a 19th century explorer, a wandering naturalist in the tradition of Darwin and Wallace. And the Harvard Gazette wrote that some of Mark's job skills bear little resemblance to those found on a typical academic resume. A love of arboreal existence, an apparent immunity to tropical diseases, rock-steady hands, and the ability to place his ankles behind his head. Wow, is that true, Mark?
Oh, I'm rock steady throughout. That's just the nature of my personality. For my thesis defense, my professor was a fellow named E.O. Wilson, and he asked if I could summarize my thesis in Latin form, and I said, no, but I can do this, and I put my legs behind my head in front of the committee, and I still managed to get the degree. So I don't know. Maybe they were just very happy folks that day. I don't know.
It's a good trick to be able to pull out, for sure. I think one of my favorite quotes from a name that I think everybody will recognize, some famous person said that Mark Moffett is the Jane Goodall of ants. And that person was, in fact, Jane Goodall.
Yes, that gives it some official aura, I guess. So there you go. That's me for sure. I can ape being an ant-man.
The ants have accepted you as one of their own.
I always tell people, don't worry about the bites of ants. It's just a sign of affection. They should just understand that ants are just trying to dig into you. They're trying to dig you. Sorry, never mind.
It's a love nibble, of course. Absolutely. Well, Mark, you've worked literally all over the world. In fact, I saw a quote from a while back that noted that you, at the time, were traveling more than the U.S. Secretary of State. So you've definitely been around. And we'll get into some of the other places that you've worked, I think, in a bit. But today, I wanted to focus on one place that you've been repeatedly, including fairly recently, I believe, and that is Australia. I am fascinated by Australia. I have been for most of my life. I have to admit, growing up, Crocodile Dundee was a pretty big influence on my early days. And so I may have had slightly skewed views of what Australia is really like. But I mean, I've been a couple of times. It's a remarkable place.
Yeah, you could be the Crocodile Dundee of biologists. So we can work that out. But yeah, no, it is a remarkable place, particularly since it's a continent that has a single government, so you can get around it easily. And it has a little bit of everything, from rainforest to absolutely dry deserts to some of the tallest forests in the world down south. It's just, and, good wine, cheese, and people.
Now, I know you've been a number of different places in Australia. I understand one of your more recent expeditions there was you were somewhere near Sydney, I believe, and you were looking at lizards that form societies. Is that right?
Yeah, my current project is with the Templeton Foundation funding is to look for different species that form societies, by which I mean they have groups with clear memberships that can last through the generations and have a territory. And so looked at that way, there are a variety of obvious things that have societies like wolves and lions and so forth. But the fun for me is to find species that no one has really thought about as having societies before. And one are these skinks, Egernia skinks, that I looked at with a couple of scientists, Jeff Weil in Tasmania, and then near Sydney, as you say, with Martin Whiting. And these skinks have groups. It could be 30 or 40 individuals, not necessarily related. Often, many of them are related, but they control rocky outcrops. And these rocky outcrops are widely separated enough that having one under your control is a big deal. So they treat their territoriality pretty damn seriously. And what they do is these researchers have come to call their societies a fury just because how aggressive they are to each other. Their version of warfare is quite extreme. What they can do is run over to the next rocky outcrop, try to grab one of their babies and eat it. Yeah, I don't think we'd want to pursue that in the human species because lizards go all the way.
Wow.
I can't imagine. So I spent some time looking at those lizards, and that was one of my excuses to get to Australia. I was down in Tasmania for a part of that and visiting the forest there with Yoav Barnes, who's an avid tree climber and studier who's looking for the world's tallest trees. So that was my other thing to do down there. Go around with him looking for trees that can compete in size with the California redwoods. Those darn Australians want to beat us. They still haven't quite found a tree tall enough, but they've gotten one up to 100 meters tall.
You're kidding. That's crazy. I had no idea that there were trees that tall in Tasmania. So what kind of trees are they?
Oh, it's, of course, a eucalyptus. Regnans, I believe, is the species. And the thought is that some of the tallest ones have already been removed because they're nice forms of lumber. So the question is whether any remaining ones can compete with the redwoods. The redwoods, of course, I think the record is 116 meters. So the eucalyptus have a ways to grow yet. But, Australians are always trying to compete with us in a number of things like good wine and tree size. Who knew? And they're marvelous trees. I look at the structure of rainforests as one of my interests, and forests in general, how animals and plants fit within this three-dimensional labyrinth overhead. So that was part of the fun of this trip.
So what did you do when you were there? So you get to Tasmania, you see these enormous trees, and are you trying to get up in them and see what's living up there? Or what did you do?
No, I just met this fellow, some years ago in India for a conference on canopy biology, which is the study of the tops of trees, right, and the tops of forests. And he wanted to show me and impress me with the size of his trees. So he's a guy who can certainly do that. If you go to Tasmania, you can look him up. He has something called Giant Trees, and just check him out. Go see a couple. I wish I'd been able to climb the trees, but, I was focused on the lizards. I'm the kind of guy that has to focus on one thing at a time.
Well, let's talk some more about these lizards. So give me a visual here. A skink is a small lizard. I think about skinks as something that I see quickly scurrying and disappear into the leaf litter or something like that. What do these skinks look like?
They do not look very impressive. They just look like skinks. They're brown and not too exciting looking. A few inches long, maybe 10 inches or something with the tail, maybe a bit more. And they're hanging out together most of the time in these little rocky spots. Most of their lives are pretty mundane until they have to go out and kill each other. So that brings out my 12-year-old instinct, which is the reason I study ants too, because we get all the sex and violence. Well, mostly violence, but in any case, with ants, it's pretty much all violence. But the skinks basically have a senior female and male in the group. And there's a wonderful video I came across by an amateur that shows probably the head female of one of these clans running after a brown snake that's approaching her ridgetop. And a brown snake sounds innocuous. I mean, everything in Australia is worse than it seems when it comes to bitiness, right?
Yeah, they're understated in their names, right? Like for something that just sounds like a very casual name, but it's like the most deadly thing in the world, right?
Yes, related to the cobra. You don't want to touch a brown snake, and it eats lizards. But this female, despite the fact it's coming up there probably to eat her offspring or friends, runs after it and keeps biting it and attacking it again and again and again, driving it off. So, these groups are quite formidable and very distinct. The thing about societies, as I mentioned, is they have clear memberships. You know who belongs and who doesn't. With the case of the lizards, they have what I call individual recognition societies. Everyone would seem to have to know everyone else as an individual. And that's distinct from the societies of humans where we can be around strangers and be comfortable. And one of the big mysteries that I see hasn't been pursued is when we made this transition, because chimpanzees know everyone in their community. They do not have strangers in their communities, and they attack anyone that gets near them from the outside, unless it happens to be a female in a sexy state, in which case the males will let her in, and the females may argue about it. But in general, chimpanzees are all aggression all the time towards outsiders, and they know everybody, and so that makes it easy. But we've added all kinds of what I call markers of identity, ways of telling who belongs and who doesn't. So I'm looking across the animal kingdom to see who does that, who has different kinds of societies, what causes those societies to stay together over time, and what tears them apart in time. And it's a tricky thing because it requires researchers on the ground who've worked on these animals for generations and generations to really figure this out. So Craig Packer has worked on lions for many decades now and can tell you a lot about this. A lot of other species like these lizards, it's less clear because we've only known about them for a few years.
So if I understand correctly, you're looking at these lizards in a way to try to understand something general about societies, and that would include human societies. So maybe even getting some practical lessons for human societies. Am I right about that?
I mean, basically, there are certain ways of making a society work, and it has nothing to do with concerns about evolutionary relationships with us and that kind of things. It's just strategies for success, what works and what doesn't. And so I've gone around the world looking at a number of species with societies. Some of the more fun ones include the vulturine guinea fowl, which is studied by Damien Farine at the Max Planck. It's a bird that looks both horrifying and gorgeous at the same time. Vulturine guinea fowl. The name gives both ends of its appearance away. And they have groups, it turns out, of 60, 80, sometimes 100 birds that are roaming around together. And all those birds know each other very well. So they recognize each other as individuals. They don't have strangers, as they say. But they actually have relationships with other groups of these birds. And so if they come across another group that they're friendly with, they'll get together for a minute, have a good time, and separate. They see a group they don't like, they avoid them or have some aggression going on. So I'd say it's something like the European Union. Everyone's either arguing or friendly, and it's changing from, year to year.
So, okay, I want to take a step back for a minute and just ask you about When you say societies, what do you really mean? Because we all know there are groups of animals that live in like a school of fish, right? A colony of ants is like a more extreme situation. But where would you draw the line and say this group is what we would consider to be a society?
Well, I have a paper out now in something called Behavioral and Brain Sciences that goes into this. Basically, I'm trying to create a perspective on societies that can work across disciplines, including animals that have certain kinds of groups, right up to humans in the past and in the present day. So I'm picked out 3 criteria, and one of them is not that only that they have a clear idea of who belongs. You're an in-group or out-group is how the social psychologists look at that, but that is an enduring type of thing, that those kind of memberships can persist year after year and generation after generation, much like a human nation does, or as it turns out, the groups of the past for humans like tribal groups and hunter-gatherer groups. So that is the kind of membership I'm talking about. And in general, these groups control a territory. But biologists tend to, I think, have an unfortunate way of considering territories. So I'm redefining what a territory is. For me, a territory is not necessarily a space where you absolutely control everything and you keep everybody out. That's not true of a territory of something like the United States. So social scientists don't think of a territory in those terms, but biologists tend to. So the point is that you can have control over that space. It doesn't mean you can't have visitors or individuals that stay for a while, but it's clear in all cases who belongs and who doesn't. And the fact is that some territories are more dynamic than others. Territories are often spoken of as if they're fixed, but over the years, Craig Packer with his lions has seen that the territories of those lions will shift gradually until, after a while, it's no longer even where it was before. And in the case of other species, territories can move in a faster way, but in all cases, control a particular space, absolutely, meaning that they can choose to let friendly neighbors in, like the vulturine guinea fowl I just mentioned. And in some cases, they absolutely keep them out, like the chimpanzees. It's all a matter of what species you're looking at.
You're listening to Wild World. I'm Scott Solomon. After a short break, we'll hear about some of the other fascinating creatures Mark Moffett has encountered during his explorations in Australia. Hi, I'm Scott Solomon. As a scientist and world traveler, I spend a lot of time on the road. And I wanted to share with you an app that can make that time more exciting, educational, and more interactive than your typical audiobook or podcast. Except for this one, of course. It's called Autio. That's Autio. And what it does is it uses GPS to follow your location, and then it gives you audio stories about the places that you're driving by. These stories are told by some of the best storytellers out there, like John Lithgow, Phil Jackson, Kevin Costner, and many others. The stories are short, usually about 3 to 5 minutes long, and they play for you as you drive. Or, if you prefer, you can plan a road trip and then find stories about those places to inspire you before you leave. And Autio's library of stories celebrate every voice and perspective. Rooted in curiosity, the storytelling embraces the diversity of cultures, people, and places that you discover along your travels, just like we do here on Wild World. Stories are updated and added every week, so no 2 journeys are ever the same. Now you can check out the Autio app through a link on our website, wildworldshow.com, or in the podcast show notes. And by doing so, you'll also help our podcast to continue to bring you explorations of the natural wonders of the world and the voices of the people who explore, study, and protect them. Welcome back. This is Wild World. I'm Scott Solomon, and I'm speaking with Mark Moffett, who's been telling me about these amazing skinks, a type of lizard that lives in Australia and has complex social behaviors.
So what are some things you learned from studying these lizards outside of Sydney?
Well, I learned what I could. Basically, I talked to the experts there who are just beginning. So the questions are really long-term ones that haven't been addressed yet. So, how long do these particular groups control these rocky outcrops? Have their progenies and grandchildren and so forth maintain control over these spaces, or do they fall apart? And what causes these groups to fall apart are really things that are unanswered. So the really big questions are ones that I'm actually trying to get into people's heads to think about. And they do require very long-term looks at these different species. And only a few people have achieved that now. Chimpanzees is another one, for example, and elephants, for example, is another case. So for most species, we don't have enough information yet. We're just beginning to get what we need to understand how their societies work. And even in chimpanzees, the average community, it turns out from genetic data, lasts for centuries. So it's not easy to actually figure these things out. Human societies last for centuries, but eventually there's some kind of schism and things fall apart. Throughout history, we've seen that again and again. They don't completely fall apart. There's no collapse. This Jared Diamond idea is inaccurate. What they do is they break apart into smaller units, and you end up with these much smaller societies with clear memberships that gradually, in the case of humans, conquer each other and create these big Maya and Aztec type civilizations over and over again as the centuries pass.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think that studying lizards could give us some insights into the formation of human societies, or maybe even some glimpse into the things that could lead to the, as you say, the breakdown of human societies. I mean, give me a sense for how. I don't think of lizards typically when I think of social or species with societies. I mean, you mentioned elephants, lions, chimpanzees. Definitely, those we know have these complex social organizations. How unusual is it for a lizard to have this kind of complex society? Are there other lizards that form societies, or is this the only one?
This little group of species in Australia is the only one I've found. There are other lizards, like the common green iguana has been studied, and they will form these groups where there's a dominant male and a number of smaller males that kind of sneak in and pretend to be female, basically, and a group of females in a particular spot. But those groups fall apart after the breeding season, and they have to reassemble with different individuals each year. So there's no sense of this kind of long-term commitment to the space and to the group.
Very interesting. Well, okay, I want to talk about some of the other places in Australia where you've worked. So we've talked about this area near Sydney. We talked a little bit about Tasmania with the tall trees. So you mentioned something that caught my attention, and that is this crazy jumping spider. You sent me a picture of one of them that I think is a photo that you took. And was this in Queensland? Is that the right location?
Queensland, yeah. The Portia jumping spider actually is a group that's spread throughout Asia, and I've seen them in different places and in Africa. And it's one of the most amazing creatures in the world. It outdoes any lion, tiger, or bear in its strategies. Jumping spiders in general are amazing. They're little things that are hopping around outside your house in the summer, and you may not notice them much. They don't make webs. They just hop about and eat mosquitoes. So be nice to your local jumping spider. And they're very sophisticated in many ways, you might say, because they have, or at least we can understand them readily, because they have very good vision. They actually understand television. They're just not interested in it unless there's a jumping spider on the tube, in which case they will delightedly court the darn female that doesn't respond to them because she's just on TV.
You're kidding. So they're reacting to other spiders on TV.
Yeah. So,
wow.
And if they're moving through your lawn, jumping from place to place, and they see a piece of prey, say a fly, they will look at it, back up, sneak around for another angle, and keep looking at it in 3 dimensions, understanding the space and where to go and to eventually catch this thing. So they're really smart creatures in that sense. There was a jumping spider called Nada that I was studying from Sri Lanka in this case, and I had it on a brick. And it was very cool because it caught ants, and it knew, depending on the kind of ant, whether it should go for the rear end or whether it was too dangerous because that ant had a stinger, and in which case it would grab it from the antennae and wear it out until it killed it. And that little jumping spider eventually figured out it was on a brick surrounded by a moat to keep it from running away. And it would put a thread at the edge of the brick, lower itself down and touch the water, and did this repeatedly until it found a piece of floating leaf, tiny piece of floating leaf, landed on it and rode its way to the edge of the water and tried to escape on me. So it built a boat, basically. So this is the kind of thing jumping spiders do. But the Portia is remarkable. The one in Australia is up in Queensland. And what it does is it depends most of the time on being a bit of debris. It just looks like a bit of debris. And it will go after all kinds of prey. If it's going after another jumping spider, for example, one of another species, it will slowly move its legs at random, following the jumping spider around, and the jumping spider will look back occasionally and just see a bit of debris and just innocently keep moving along. And eventually I've seen a jumping spider think, oh, I need a break into some shade, and actually hop under the Portia. And the Portia, when the other jumping spider is beneath it, will flip out a fang and stab it down and kill the other jumping spider and eat it, of course.
Yeah.
But it will actually do all kinds of things. If it's looking at species of colonial spiders which have courtship dances, it's able to mimic the dances. If it's going after a spider living on a web that catches mosquitoes, it will walk up to the web and vibrate the web with its palps, parts of its mouth, to make it vibrate in the same way a mosquito would vibrate if it was caught in that web. If it's going after a spider with a web that catches big prey like moths, it will yank the web around as if it was a moth. But the cool thing is you can take a Portia to North America where it's never seen these spiders before that it's having to hunt, and it will figure out which technique to use. And then weeks later, remember, when it comes back to when you give it another spider of that kind, and use the same technique again.
Wow, that's incredible. So these are like highly intelligent spiders they're like devising. They remind me of like a movie villain, like a Bond villain or something. It's like coming up with this elaborate plan to catch its prey and then like devising a scheme.
What a loser Spider-Man is compared to this. I mean, if just they learned to talk to me, we could give them some good material. My favorite, though, for this spider is in New Guinea. There's a web-building spider that builds webs a couple meters wide. And if you're walking along in New Guinea, not looking where you're going, and you will bounce off this web if you hit it, because it's actually strong enough that the New Guinea tribal people use it as a fishing net in some places. And the spider in it is enormous, several inches long. They eat birds, for heaven's sakes.
Oh, my God.
And a Portia, which is like a half inch at most with its legs extended, enters this web, moving very slowly and at random so not to generate any pattern to giant thing excited. And it takes hours for it to get to the middle of the web. And this thing is there bigger than a brontosaurus above it. And it slowly pulls itself up and looks over the top of this giant spider where the male version of the spider is sitting, a tiny little male on top of his enormous female, and tries to grab it off the top of the female. I mean, this is a spider that's doing it just because it's there, like climbing Everest. This is a spider that's a total generalist. It's trying all kinds of things all the time. We think of nature as having these narrowly confined niches where a species does this or that. And I tell you, by comparison, a lion just runs towards things and leaps. I mean, not enough for me. Sorry.
Yeah, lions are boring.
Okay, I'm exaggerating slightly, but still.
You've got me convinced. I want to go see these spiders myself now. So I'm going to go book a flight to Australia just so I can check these out. That sounds absolutely amazing.
I have a fee. There you go.
Oh, okay. Well,
I'll
invite you to come along. You can introduce me to them.
This is Wild World. My guest is ecologist storyteller Mark Moffett. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, I'll ask Mark about his encounters with one of Australia's most notorious small creatures.
To support this Wild World podcast, please check out Autio. It's an app that gives you amazing stories told by some of the world's best storytellers, such as John Lithgow, Phil Jackson, and Kevin Costner, and it's uniquely curated based on your location. It's a perfect audio travel companion for any road trip or just learning more about a trip you want to take. Click on the link in our show notes for more information.
This is Wild World. My guest is ecologist storyteller Mark Moffett.
So I know you've studied and you've photographed and you've written about all of these different species, but you and I know each other, I think, first and foremost because we're both ant biologists by training. And I know a lot of your career you've focused on ants in particular. And Australia has some pretty amazing ants, right? I mean, one of the most infamous, I think, even if you're not an ant geek like us, but the so-called bulldog ants, right? Have you had any run-ins with them?
Oh, I've had extensive run-ins with the bull or bulldog ants, also called jack jumpers in some places. Right. They're one of these things, again, that don't appear in the brochures when you decide to go to Australia. They don't emphasize the bulldog ants. But
they show the kangaroos and the koalas.
Oh, the good stuff is left out. Mm-hmm. Like the brown snake mentioned earlier, but this is even more intense. This ant, did you ever know Justin Smith?
I never met him personally, but I certainly know about his famous pain index.
The Smith pain index. And the bull or bulldog ant is the top of the list. He gives it a complete 4. And it competes, it's at the same level as the Paraponera clavata from South America, the bullet ant.
That's the bullet ant, sure.
And I actually wrote down here how he describes this. He gives these wonderful descriptions of each level of pain. This guy died recently, sadly, but he gave gorgeous descriptions of pain. He just went around letting things bite and sting him for a living.
Yeah, I mean, the idea was that like you can't, if you get bit by something or stung by something and I get stung by the same thing, we can't compare because we experience pain differently, right? So he decided to take one for the team and get stung by all of them, right?
Right, and figure out how to describe it. We don't normally think of how to describe levels of pain. It's like taste. How do you describe things taste? It's very tricky. There are so many ways, parameters to taste. And pain for him was the big one to describe. So for the bullet ant, he describes it, I wrote it down here, pure, intense, brilliant pain, like walking over flaming charcoal with a 3-inch nail embedded in your heel.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Not for me, thanks. That's the bullet ant. That's the one from South America. That's the bullet
ant, but he put the bulldog ant at the same level. And I have been stung by a bullet ant. It fell on my forehead, and I wiped it off, I think, in time. So I don't know if I got the full dose. Oh. And there are stories to tell about that one, too. But the bulldog ant in Australia is quite intense and something to look for. Because if you're walking along in Australia and you look down, you see an inch-long ant, a very large ant, actually turn and look up at you and then start running after you. That is a bulldog ant.
That's intense. Is that how they get the name bulldog, I guess, right? That's like a ferocious attitude.
And it will actually be able to leap on you from a distance. So you should, in fact, keep your distance from these characters. And the expert on them, Robert Taylor, was once mentioned in a National Geographic article as saying that 30 of them can kill a person. And I spoke to Robert about this, visiting him down there in Australia to look for these ants. And I said, 30, that's an awfully specific number. And he said, well, yeah, the editors kept harassing me until I had to give a number. So 30 may be just approximate, but, there you go. Yeah, so those are one of the wonderful ants of Australia. Another one is the weaver ant up north. And if you're walking around with even a European ancestor person in the north of Australia, in Queensland, you will often see them pull an ant off a leaf and say, have you tried one of these? And eat it. So it's become popular, not even with the Aboriginal peoples, but with everybody else. They're very tasty. They're used as a condiment in India. They add a lot of flavor. I've had them as a tapenade in Cambodia with chicken. It was delicious.
Wow.
And they make very complex societies up in the trees in these 3-dimensional spaces we talked about earlier. They weave together these nests by pulling the leaves into a tent and using their own larvae, child labor, in other words, and guiding them along and laying down silk from one leaf to the next until they have this leaf nest. And they make dozens of these nests scattered through the trees strategically to keep the enemies out. The exterior nests just have the elderly worker ants, which are the battle axes that keep the enemies away. One of my favorite things about these weaver ants, which has to do with this whole idea of a colony or a society and in-groups and out-group and who belongs, weaver ants and other ants are like humans and a few other species in using signals of identity so that they can have strangers in their societies. Ants don't need to know each other individually, and that means that their societies can grow very large. A chimpanzee society where everyone has to know everyone else is just a few dozen individuals, up to a little over a couple hundred. But ants obviously can have huge colonies. And one of the jumping spiders of this area, to get back to this thread, is a species that likes to eat weaver ants. And the weaver ants do not like this, and they will attack it. And what it does is it grabs the larvae of the weaver ant, the young weaver ants, and eats those, and eventually gets enough juices on its body that it starts to smell like the ants. And it turns out that the smell of the ants, the odor of its body surface, is its national flag. It determines who belongs and who doesn't. Hydrocarbons on the body surfaces of ants. And so it begins to smell like the ants. And now the jumping spider can move inside of their nests and live among them and eat their larvae as it wishes. The soldier ants are not quite convinced all the time, so it has to be a little cautious. But the really interesting thing is if that jumping spider leaves that nest, hops along, again, it doesn't have a web, this kind of spider, it just hops from place to place, and goes over to another tree with another weaver ant colony, it's attacked, not as a spider, but as a foreign ant.
Oh.
So it's actually perceived as belonging to a particular colony, and it becomes a member of the colony.
Wow. So have you considered coating yourself in this chemical so you can be fully accepted by the ants as well?
You can join my cult by writing me at drbugs.com.
There you go. Send a scratch and sniff cuticular hydrocarbon profile so we can see if you belong. That's right.
Oh, awesome. Yes.
So one of the other sort of things that is a famous ant story and ant discovery in Australia is what some people call the dinosaur ant, which was known for a time, but then was disappeared. Is that right? And I think these are from the south of Australia. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it's a famous story that became a legend in myrmecology, the study of ants, because a young lady was on a picnic in Western Australia and collected a couple ants and gave them to someone working in a museum. She was an amateur entomologist on her side, the young lady, and it sat in the cabinet and then was recognized as it didn't belong to any ant group. It looked like a totally primitive ant. Just did not fit in. And so many people came to Australia, and she didn't give a location, just the Western Desert, which is like saying California as a destination. Okay, what is that? So many people, a guy named Bill Brown, who was a famous fellow for studying ant taxonomy, went on expeditions. Ed Wilson, E.O. Wilson, went on expeditions and never found it, couldn't figure out where to go. And then this Robert Taylor, who I mentioned earlier, for the bulldog ant, goes on an expedition, and he's just starting his expedition. He hasn't gone very far. He's in South Australia, not over to the Western Desert yet. And he pulls over at a gas station and takes what we technically call a whiz at the back of the gas station and looks at the wall of the gas station in front of them, and there is one of them. And this town is called Poochera, and I've been there. It's the only town in the world that survives on tourism because of ants. It has giant ants. It has ant billboards. It has an ant museum.
Oh, my gosh.
So, yes, and this is still pretty much the primary place to find them. We still don't know where this lady originally found hers. Unfortunately for Poochera, though I don't think they want to disseminate this information, it turns out this is not the most primitive ant. It's just a very bizarre ant. It's its own subfamily of ants, which is important enough for us professional ant people.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's super cool. Wow. So, okay, you've been all over Australia, all these amazing places and seen all these amazing creatures. Any near-death experiences or wild adventures that you care to share?
Near-death experiences in Australia? Well, having cold spaghetti on toast for breakfast is wild enough for me.
Well, I mean, I was going to ask you about the other sort of notorious food item from Australia, and I'm sure we have some Australian listeners that are going to write angry emails now, but Vegemite, that's the stuff that I like to think of myself as an adventurous eater with a wide palate, but I really struggle with Vegemite.
Meanwhile, you would probably love the weaver ants. They're just tasty little morsels on a tree.
I would prefer the weaver ants, yeah.
Of course, the big thing in Australia nobody talks about, not exactly an adventure unless you're there, are their meat pies. You never have seen people so addicted to meat pies.
Oh, those are
they're
great.
Famous places for their meat pies. So that is what you do to fuel up between climbing trees or looking for ants there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, Mark, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you got into all this in the first place. I love to hear people's sort of origin stories. And I was going back through some of your books, and I think this particular mention was in Adventures Among Ants. But you wrote that you, quote, turned a boy's obsession into a career. So is it true you were obsessed by bugs and by ants in particular, even as a kid?
Oh, my God. My God. Of course. And so were you. And so is everyone listening to this. They've just forgotten it.
Yeah.
Everybody listening to this was down there in their diapers, as an infant, watching ants and other small creatures until you were convinced that this was not important. I showed commitment. I stuck with it because we are interested in ants down there in the dirt when we're an infant size for good reasons. They are doing all kinds of things in a very coordinated fashion, much as we do. They're moving resources around, defending the troops. They've got building all kinds of infrastructure, including complex nests. In the case of large nests, even having air conditioning systems and things like that, highway systems with traffic rules in some cases, all kinds of things that intrigue us at first and actually have a certain parallels to humans. And people go like, well, you can't compare humans and ants. And I wrote a paper about this, Apples and Oranges, Ants and Humans, the Misunderstood Art of Making Comparisons, where I point out, among other things, that comparing two things that are identical is extremely boring.
Yeah, that's true.
You got to compare when you find points of comparisons between things you don't expect, that's when you make interesting discoveries. Mm-hmm. And the fact is, ants do not have big brains, and a lot of these things are basically genetically determined, but they're having to deal with the world with the same kinds of problems that we do. Once you have a huge population, you have to figure out how to get the resources to the right place to feed everybody. You have to figure out how to get your defense squads out there. You have to figure out how to deal with public health issues. And ants do all those kinds of things.
And so you saw this even as a kid, or like these are things that you came to appreciate like as you studied ants as a biologist, right? A Harvard-trained PhD biologist, or like take me through like how did you go from a kid, like as you say, all of us were on the ground just sort of noticing ants and being curious. How did you go from that to actually getting to study them professionally?
Yeah, well, you as an infant, you're, as I say, noticing the basic things, including these highways and various structural things, and the fact that they move in big groups and deal with problems as groups, including retrieving food and other things. Those are things you can clearly see. My last bit describing some of the other attributes are the ways you evolve to look at it in more sophisticated ways over time, right? You begin to look at the nitty-gritty of some of these parallels. And so basically what happened to me was in junior high school, I joined a science book club and I got something called the Insect Societies. It was one of 3 books for like $4 or something. And this was by the fellow who became my mentor, E.O. Wilson. And I didn't know half the words in it, but it was just clear that this was very cool stuff. All these little creatures were down there doing excellent things. And actually, Ed Wilson once told me that it's very useful to use words that people don't know on occasion in writing because they have to imagine what they mean. And so my imagination went wild with a book where about a third of the words I didn't know. So I eventually, I dropped out of high school. I was doing very poorly, but I got into a small liberal arts college called Beloit, which was very open to me because I had gotten to know some of their professors. So I was doing projects with them on various things. And I started doing field work on a number of different creatures, including butterflies, taking on the jobs that normally a postdoc would do, helping a researcher. So I was really dysfunctional in all the ways except the ones that mattered, which are the ones that made me what I am. I'm either doing what I do now or working at McDonald's. There's nothing in between for me. I have no functionality in other ways. So I had this love of this book, and I got into Woods Hole, a summer program for students out in the East Coast. And I dropped by Harvard, and I was from a very small liberal arts college where we all knew our professors really well and knew them by their first names and so forth. I had no idea what Harvard was or what the expectations were there. So I knock on Ed Wilson's door, the professor, and call him Ed and gave him a big double handshake like this, which I later saw in the movie Being There, which was, anyway, you see that movie where a fellow who is totally mentally incapacitated ends up becoming president of the United States basically by the end because people misinterpret everything he's doing as being brilliant. So I'm just making social errors here, left and right. And he invites me in, and we get down on the floor of his office and start looking at pictures of ants. And I realized in retrospect that he was another 12-year-old or 18-year-old at that point, right? He was another kid. He behaved like another kid. Mm-hmm. And that is what I look for in people now, in academics. Scott, you do a good job with that too. You get that energy that isn't driven by ego, even if the ego is there. It's driven by just a passion for like figuring out something about the world. Yep. And so I got into Harvard somehow, and he guided me through and left me basically alone to try all these different things, including going to Asia for grad school. So I'm very appreciative of that.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. You walked your way in and charmed them. That's great. I mean, but like you said, it's that natural passion and enthusiasm that a lot of us just tuck away as we grow older. And it's awesome to be able to have a career where you get to continue to pursue that. I love it.
I think that's more important, in fact, than a massive knowledge of the subject. It's just the energy to move your way forward, because from what I can tell, you can know too much about a subject. I actually tell students you can get too absorbed in things. And I think that's why a lot of the creative things that happen in science happen when we're young, even when we're ignorant and young. As you get old, your brain gets filled with all this stuff, and thinking in new directions actually becomes more difficult for us. Yeah, ignorance is bliss, but it's also a way of success if you also treat it the right way.
That's right. I mean, we also see like people who change fields or change careers. They often bring like cool, interesting insights into the new field that they're moving into.
Let's take another quick break. When we come back, I'll ask Mark about how he became a National Geographic photographer.
To support this Wild World podcast, please check out Autio. It's an app that gives you amazing stories told by some of the world's best storytellers, such as John Lithgow, Phil Jackson, and Kevin Costner, and it's uniquely curated based on your location. It's a perfect audio travel companion for any road trip or just learning more about a trip you want to take. Click on the link in our show notes for more information.
Welcome back to Wild World. I'm speaking with Mark Moffett, who has traveled the world studying some of the world's lesser-known wild creatures and telling their stories.
So one of the things that you're really known for as well, in addition to your work on ants and your research on societies and humans and animals, is your photography, right? And you've taken these just absolutely amazing photos, often of really tiny things like ants, but larger subjects as well. And I know you worked for many years with National Geographic and published many stories with them, with your photos and your writing as well. How did you first get started with that kind of photography? I think it was linked to your research in some way, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, Scott, that was indeed. And I wasn't necessarily going forward to be a photographer. That photography was a tool. And it was a tool that I realized was necessary because when I got into graduate school, Ed Wilson was great. But, have you been to Harvard? There's a bit of a little tension going on. There's that Harvard tension thing going on. And I was from a small town, small school. And I wanted to get out into the field right away and escape from that. And I basically went through the ant collection at Harvard, which is the largest in the world. The primary reason Harvard is successful and great is their ant collection. People don't know that. It's a very
it's
large
a secret
room
to their
of
success.
just ants. Yeah. And I found a drawer of ants that I'd never heard of before, Phytologeton, they were called at the time, and they were massively cool looking with this polymorphism from tiny to large, which all these things, when ants look strange, it means something cool is going on because it means they're building tools to do jobs that are unexpected. And I'm looking at these ants. And so I go to Ed and say, I want to study these. They're in Asia. And he says, oh, most students go to Costa Rica. And I said, no, Asia. And I got money together to disappear for a record 2.5 years away from grad school, avoiding committee meetings and the whole thing. And I realized to be gone as long as I wanted, I had to document what I was doing in a way people would believe me when I say certain things were happening. And I had to figure out how to take photographs. And so I got a used camera and some tiny little flashes from Underground Camera in Cambridge. And I put these things together and went into the field. And before I left, all I had time to do was photograph dead ants on a gray card. It's an 18% gray card, just to see that it worked. So I get to India for my first 6 months. I live in India on one $100 traveler's check. And I have
for
this
6 months.
camera. Yeah, and I have in the small villages, I'm wearing lungis and chapels and chewing betel nuts. I was totally Indian. I had the head motion and the whole thing down and I was comfortably fitting in this small village, and it was wonderful. And I took 6 rolls of film. Remember film?
I do.
And you had no idea what was on those things, right?
No, it's a mystery until you develop it, yeah.
And so at the end of the 6 months, I asked National Geographic again to give me some money, and I asked if they developed my film. So I sent the film to all the way to National Geographic, and I got a telex, I guess it was back then, saying that they were going to send someone out to talk to me. And I'm going like, wait a second. And mind you, I'd never seen my own pictures of ants, just dead ants on gray cards. And so a fellow flies into Bangalore, and I meet him at the fanciest steak restaurant in Bangalore. We're eating these big steaks, and he's looking very skeptical of the food and everything else. And to me, this was like, oh my God, this is like the most amazing upper class thing I've seen ever in my life, this steak and so forth. And apparently my pictures turned out pretty well. And so basically, I asked for much more film and so forth so I could keep doing this. And what I do is I look through this camera, which is a long tube to magnify the ants, and I just press the button every time something happens. That's the whole mystery of photography, right? And I happen to have enough magnification that I could make that ant look huge. And that's the other wonderful thing about photography. You have to forget how small something is. You have to get people into the place of that ant. You have to get them down to that level. When you do baby photography, you have to be down at the level of the baby. When you do ant photography, you have to be covered with dirt. And so I just had that impulse of getting down at the level of the ant and pressing the button when something happened. And that was photography for me. And when I have a story to tell, I do photography. I have a good story to tell even now, but it's just a tool I use. And when I talk to people who want to go into photography, I say, the difficulty isn't the photography, it's the story. You have to have a story. That's what National Geographic needs. That's what other places need. So I always tell them, don't go into photography, go into sociology or anthropology or whatever it is, and find a story, and then use photography to tell the story.
Well, and it seems like one of the secrets to your success, just as an outside observer, is partly you've looked where other people haven't looked, but you've also, they say appreciate the little things in life. I mean, you're the guy that will get down on the forest floor, crawling amongst the ants and looking at the tiny action that's happening there. And it just seems like there's so many stories to be told there among the little things of the world, right? I don't know. What do you think?
There are stories everywhere, and stories that haven't been told everywhere. I've done whole National Geographic stories on life in an acorn, just on acorns in my backyard. They couldn't understand why my budget was so low. So it's like, okay, what am I going to spend it on? I'm in my backyard with acorns. But yeah, it's finding stories that haven't been told. One of my other Australia stories was done with a guy named Gary Dodson, who has studied antlered flies, which are tephritid flies. They're basically relatives of fruit flies. And they have antlers that they use to fight with, like deer. And favorite writer and scientist of all time, Alfred Russel Wallace, had a book where it has an illustration of these flies. And I look at those and I go like, wait, I haven't even heard of these since then. So I found out that Gary was doing this research, and we flew to northern Australia to a town in Cape York, which will remain nameless, which was the most Wild West thing I'd ever seen. All night, there was gunfire all over the place. Wow. The place where we stayed, as you walk up the steps, you realize there are these black dots flinging themselves at you. They were fleas. I've never seen anything like that. We basically got a flea bomb for the whole place. You're not supposed to move into a space after using one of these flea bombs for a couple of days, but we just had to move in. So this was a real Wild West. But these flies were out there with their big antlers. In this case, they were not huge, bigger ones we found in New Guinea. And they would actually get together, the males would get together and fight, usually with a female nearby to impress. My favorite thing about those flies is that some of them, they vary in how big their antlers are. There are Arnold Schwarzenegger flies, and there are Danny DeVito flies. And we found out that if we glued extensions on the flies with small antlers, they would win more battles. So we were doing, fly surgery for their own good.
That's crazy. Oh, my gosh. Wow. What a great career you've had traveling the world, looking at all of these amazing creatures. And certainly Australia has its fair share of remarkable creatures, including some of the lesser known ones that we've been talking about. But I think one of my takeaways from this conversation is also that you could just look in your backyard, wherever you live in the world, right? If you get down on your hands and knees and pay attention like we used to as kids to the things that are crawling around in the soil and on the trees, that there's all sorts of remarkable things happening all around us.
Stories are everywhere. Just find one.
Absolutely. Well, Mark Moffett, thanks so much for sharing all these stories and adventures with us. It's been so much fun talking with you.
Hey, Scott, let's go have an adventure. Come on.
All right, let's do it.
That's it for this episode. To learn more about Mark Moffett's incredible career as an ecologist storyteller, check out his website, drbugs.com. You can also learn about his most recent project on the life and death of societies at the Templeton Foundation's website, templeton.org. There's also a link in our show notes and on our website, wildworldshow.com. We also have links to some of Mark's latest articles. Did you know Wild World has a YouTube channel? Check it out to see video from my conversation with Mark Moffett and for short bonus content from some of our other episodes. We even did a live broadcast from Antarctica. This episode of Wild World was produced by 3Wire Creative. I'm Scott Solomon. Join us next time as we explore another part of our wild world.